Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am Dr. Bridget Custon. I am an economic anthropologist and a research fellow at the Said Business School. In my day job, I am part of a multidisciplinary project that studies large family owners who own businesses with revenue above $1 billion a year. And as a human and member of the Said community, I have been fortunate enough to be a part of conversations happening at the school around diversity, equity, and inclusion, both what's happening within the environment of the school and also what the school needs to do to help businesses, to help MBA students, to help the executives who come through our executive education programs. And as part of those efforts, the executive education team has convened a series called Intersectionality and Inclusion, which is not necessarily the standard title that one sees these days, but one that we think is really important, and we'll get to why that is later. And as part of that series, we're having 3 events. And then what's really exciting is that not only do we have those 3 events, but we also have smaller conversations that we're curating with interesting people like Jim Carrick Birtwell, of Future Talent Group. Hello, Jim.
Hello.
And this is where we get to explore the messiness and complexity of inclusion, diversity, equity, and all of these topics that are not new topics, but they have new energy around them because of some incredibly violent and disturbing murders that have happened at the hands of police, state actors, individuals, of Black people in the United States. But these issues are not confined to the United States, they're global. Likewise, the individuals that engage with our business school come from across the world. So I'm just delighted to have Jim here to have a discussion around these topics. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jim to introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Bridget. Well, likewise, I'm really looking forward to this conversation and delighted to be invited to take part in this, I guess, framing conversation. So just to introduce myself, I'm Jim Carrick Birtwell, and I'm the founder and chief executive of Future Talent Group, which the parent company is also called Changeboard. So that's a business I set up in 2004. And we do many things, but actually, I guess the thing we're most known for is creating events all over the world and producing content for all sorts of organizations. And Future Talent focuses on what are the big changes affecting the world of work, particularly looked at through the lens of people and talent. So that's, if you like, our specialist area. The 2 consistent strands, golden threads, if you like, throughout our, if you like, our DNA from the start, have always been around learning and inclusion. And I'm really proud that we've championed issues across the spectrum of diversity, inclusion, equity, whether that's been to do with gender, LGBTQ, social mobility, looking at all sorts of aspects, obviously race and inequality, and we're actually all about collaboration. So I think as a business, we position ourselves, and our modus operandi is as kind of co-creators, co-curators of interesting insights and perspectives, rather than the holders of knowledge. So in the spirit of that sets up the partnership that we've had over many years, actually, with Oxford University's Said Business School, where we bring together groups of senior individuals who are responsible for some of these kind of challenges, and they're often really kind of difficult, gnarly challenges where there's no clear way through, and actually bringing different perspectives to bear on a challenge, and listening and hearing other people and how they're dealing with it, the experiments that they've tried. I'm absolutely convinced that is a very profound and relevant modus operandi for our times. So delighted to be working with you, Bridget, on this conversation. And actually, I'm gonna kick off, if I may.
Wait, before you do.
Yeah.
So what you do, you produce these events, these educational events, but then you also produce educational bespoke content for companies, large corporates.
Yeah.
So this really means that you are a first responder when it comes to how companies are responding to um, calls for greater diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? They're coming to you and saying, we need an online module, we need a training, and then you have to produce it. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, broadly speaking. So our learning business actually, so Future Talent Learning is all about what are the skills, the mindsets and behaviors that executives need at all sorts of different levels for the changing world of work. And when we specifically focus on interpersonal human skills and, how you deal with things like inclusion, subjects like that have now become central elements for leaders. It used to be that a leader was judged by, can you run an effective P&L, period.
Mhm.
Actually, as I'm sure we'll come on to, the events of recent years have accelerated the demands on leaders. So they are now judged by, are you authentically empathetic? Do you really care about what's going on in your business as a leader? Are you able to look at the sustainability of everything that your business is involved with?
Mhm.
And can you be truly inclusive in many different manifestations? That's absolutely core. So
Mhm.
we're delighted that we're involved in learning of that ilk.
Mhm.
But obviously from a comms perspective as well, as you rightly say, we're producing this content for other organizations. So I think the key for us is to never be a prophet ahead of our time. I'm enormously proud of the
Mm.
fact that I have never, and none of my team have ever commissioned a futurologist to be involved in any of our events, because actually there's so much that's right on the cusp of what we need to know, and I think
Mhm.
that's what people are really interested in. And I guess our job is to try and be reading the zeitgeist and helping people navigate the zeitgeist.
And probably to be, though, maybe just a bit ahead of the zeitgeist so that you can push
Yeah,
companies where they need to go.
absolutely.
So this is interesting if we think about, the landscape of change and what it takes to push change in corporations in this area. You have the corporations themselves, but they're not undertaking the work of change on their own. It happens with these external entities, intermediaries, consultants, advisors, content creators, and that's squarely where you sit. So in many ways, these conversations around, business responses, whether to, COVID or to the murder of George Floyd and what that means for supporting their own uh, Black workforce, it's what the corporates are doing, but it's also what then you and your company are pushing them to do. It's a really interesting vantage point onto the topics.
Yeah, and I think it brings a particular responsibility as well,
Mm,
because you have to be very thoughtful, very reflective. You've got to
mm,
canvas broadly, and you've got to be aware of your blind spots as well
mhm,
when you are curating, because
mhm,
the nature of that is you have you have to be aware that you are shaping agendas.
mm, mm,
And I think that is something that just having an awareness of that is really important, and actually passing that back in the spirit of that. Your role within the business school, and actually the role of the business school, I'd be really interested in just exploring what your particular take is on the subject in front of us. So as you said, intersectionality and inclusion is not the standard way of framing these conversations. So it would be lovely to hear your take of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Um, what are you covering? How does intersectionality and inclusion cover that? Which aspects of it is it focused on or dealing with?
So, something that has come up even in our own schools, anti-racism task force work, is that the minute you shine a spotlight on one group who is in a position of being marginalized or needing support, needing equal access, that other groups who understand themselves to be marginalized or in need of support say, well, what about us? And then the conversation becomes, okay, if we have limited resources, who do we prioritize first? Do we do gender empowerment? Do we focus on race initiatives? What about disability? What about LGBTQ issues? What about socioeconomic support for those who come from poor backgrounds? And then people can get overwhelmed and it becomes paralytic and people don't know where to start. I mean, I would imagine that this is going to be a shared experience for many people at the helm of organizations. And the utility of grappling with inclusion and what it means is that we no longer have a zero-sum game. So Kimberly Crenshaw is a lawyer, and when she was at UCLA in Los Angeles, I believe, she came up with the concept of intersectionality to deal with what she was observing in her legal work, which is that the extant laws were not accommodating the unique issues that Black female victims of violence were enduring. The legal system couldn't see the specificity of their circumstances as Black women whose experiences were at, and here's the key, at the nexus of gender and race. So the inability of the law to accommodate that led her to come up with the concept of intersectionality, which at its heart proposes that these constitutive elements of identity are not zero sum, but rather they are additive. So this takes us away from what can easily be a corporate approach to issues of inclusion, which is to say a tick box exercise, quotas, where you just need to have women, you just need to have Black, Asian, minority individuals in certain roles. And the point is to move away from that and to understand that it's not about prioritizing one group over another, but we have to understand that challenges exist at the confluence of the identities that every person possesses. And once we start to understand that human uniqueness, we can then move forward with a way that actually accounts for the fact that, I mean, it sounds obvious, but that people are complex. And the way that we often look at people who are in marginalized positions is to flatten that complexity and to say, well, you're a woman, and so this is your bucket of issues, or you are Black, these are your bucket of issues. But where does that leave people who experience their femaleness and their racial identity and their religion as all parts of a whole? So this might seem a little abstract, and it is abstract, and that's the whole point of having this series, is to start to parse what this abstraction means and looks like in practice. You know, one of the consequences of that is that if we're talking about supporting female entrepreneurs, for example, I mean, there is no kind of right way to be a female entrepreneur. They don't need the same kind of support. The challenges are different. And it does mean that, you know, one size fits all solutions are not the way to go. It takes more work to engage with people as the complex humans that they are. And this is tough for corporates because, you know, let's face it, inefficiency and complexity costs more money to acknowledge, right? It can't be slotted neatly into pre-designed systems. So there is a need to shift how I think corporations even approach these issues and to sort of accept that more nuance is needed and more complexity is needed. And so, yeah, this series is an entry point for people to start to think about what that means and what that looks like.
Yeah, but and I'm wondering, in terms of your experience, my instinct with this is that on the one hand, you could look at it as, because it's becoming more nuanced and it's looking at an individual's, you know, multifaceted and idiosyncratic protected characteristics. But in doing so, if you get a true lived experience from an individual and they tell their story, that also resonates and moves hearts and minds at a level that the general doesn't. I don't know whether that's something that you've experienced or witnessed.
Yeah, it is. You know, the lived experience is a phrase that is starting to pop up more and more because it's very difficult to argue against the truth of someone's own experiences. If they're coming to you with their reality, how can I disabuse you of that which you feel and know to be true for you? You know, the thing that comes up though in this diversity, equity, and inclusion work is the frequency with which people who have lived experiences of racism or marginalization or suffering sometimes get called on to perform essentially their pain for others, let's say for white people, to educate them. And that's not a tenable position,
Mm.
right? To put the onus for educating upon people and to have them relive or rehash their pain for the edification of someone else's education. And, even with my kind of own friends on Twitter, like on social media, the narratives abound. If someone wants to access stories of suffering and pain and heartache, you only have to do a couple keyword searches really to
Mm.
bring those to light.
Mm.
And the problem is when people who are in a position of privilege start asking others to, yeah, to perform their pain or suffering for them. How do
Mm.
you how do you deal with that with the events that you curate and the content that you curate? Do you find that that you have to kind of have an emotional or kind of heart wrenching piece in there for people to sort of sit up and take attention? Can these issues ever
I do.
exist solely in the abstract?
No, not at all. I don't think that works. So I did an English degree, and I, was very fortunate, privileged to go to Oxford University. I was at St Hugh's College, and I had a very dear tutor called Dr. Avril Bruton, and she was absolutely besotted with rhetoric. And the kind of thing that I've taken away from that was this sort of this tripartite to teach, to delight, and to move people. And actually, it's one of the single things I've taken away from that particular phase of my education, which has really stayed with me. And I understand it in the work that I do every day, particularly with events. And to answer your question, um, thinking about how you frame events and what you're trying to get out of them. And I guess to teach is passing certain information across. To delight people is I think having some fun and learning that doesn't feel like learning. But moving people, if I'm, I spend a lot of time at university directing plays. That's kind of the origins, I guess, of what I do professionally. And I would never be happy with any event that I'm running or back in the day, play that I was producing if it didn't move people. But moving people, I've since realized, comes in lots and lots of different forms. And you can't constantly move people because that's exhausting, right? So any play is going to have lots of kind of, shades of teaching, delighting, and move people. But I think telling stories, it does shift the dial, because I think a lot of the conversations that I've been involved with, for example, around our recent conference, Purpose, Meaning and Culture, we had quite a few sessions in terms of exploring the issues raised by Black Lives Matter. I was really provoked to make sure that we had, a full range of perspectives from Black people represented, not just talking about inclusion, talking about their expertise in all sorts of areas. But actually, when you were hearing lived experiences of people, it created a different quality of conversation and moved people in a different way. If I give you an example of that, artistic director Kwame Kweyama, who's the artistic director of the Young Vic, and a brilliant kind of leader in the arts in this country, and has been so for 7 years in Baltimore in the US. And he was kind of reflecting on, what is this moment that has happened arising from Black Lives Matter? And actually, he said, it's kind of allowed the shroud to drop in terms of, diversity has shrouded structural inequality, against Black people. And, that anti-Black racism has been sort of covered with a sort of generalization of BAME. And actually, the social injustice of this year and the tragic death of George Floyd, and the sort of concatenation of lots of other kind of social forces going on, whether it's to do with the rise of populism, whether it's to do with, the pandemic, has allowed a moment to arise where he said, actually, we can now speak openly about the specificity that's required to deal with social injustice.
So I have a confession to make.
Please.
Whenever I hear a man say that it wasn't until he had a daughter that he started to care about women's rights, that was the moment at which he was moved and could suddenly see women as full human beings. On a good day, I roll my eyes and sigh, and on a bad day, I find it very offensive. What do we do with this question of moving people when it sort of suggests that, there's some really uncomfortable admissions about what people are making about who they were before or what they believed before when they confess to being moved, right? Because if you're moved from point A to point B, that point A, it can be a really uncomfortable thing to reveal yourself as having held a set of views. I feel like I don't need to hear from men that they didn't care or see women as full human beings until they had a daughter. I find it offensive, frankly. What kind of admissions are being provoked here in the education of people that might offend others? Do we have to hold space for them as well?
I think if the goal is everybody moving collectively towards a better future, then if there is a certain vulnerability and honesty that's required to get there, then I think that creating safe places for whatever your narrative is, if it's confessional in nature, then I think, we all know that if you want to change, that's part of the change process, that's self-awareness. And whether it's to do with having a daughter or as again, referencing Kwame again, he was saying that talking about in terms of changes in approach and attitude towards race has to acknowledge white fragility. And a parallel that he shared, which I thought was very powerful, was the fragility that he felt at the outbreak of the Me Too movement. Because he said that actually for a lot of men will have caused an enormous insecurity and vulnerability and auditing, huge aspects and histories of your life and interactions. So not necessarily wittingly, although obviously in some cases wittingly, crossing boundaries and the prospect of being held accountable to that. And I think him sharing that vulnerability and saying, and so, I can empathize with this, the issues raised by Black Lives Matter, creating a similar kind of insecurity and vulnerability in white people that I have to understand and I have to be there. And I think that if you can create that common sense of understanding about what's required to move forward and change, I think that's very powerful. You've got a lot of experience in terms of gender inclusion and women's empowerment. I kind of wonder whether what on the face of it I've described as kind of well-intentioned practices, whether you think that holds sway or whether you think that's actually not really the full deal.
Well, I think you just touched on something really interesting, which was that you talked about Me Too in the context of how a man is receiving that movement, whereas so much rightly about the discussion surrounding Me Too is how it has been transformative for women. They realize they're not alone. The shame around what they may have experienced can dissipate. They experience it as empowering. But what's really important to note is how those conversations have not necessarily created space for men to have an honest, vulnerable conversation around as you said, an auditing of one's past, realizing that there is behavior, that might have happened that was not suitable. How does that affect one's view of themselves in the present? What does this mean for practices moving forward? How does this reshape dating norms, norms of masculinity, right? There's, one of the things that's really interesting and that we will talk about in session 2 of this series, which focuses on women's empowerment by focusing on 3 entrepreneur CEOs, is that the empowerment of women cannot happen without men, right? It's to somehow silo off the experiences of women from the men in their lives, and to take a more expansive gender approach away from the binary view of men and women, just the experiences of women within a kind of evolving set of practices, norms, discourses, identifications around gender. That anyway, there's a conversation there that needs to happen, and to then take that and apply it toward conversations around race. There's a tendency to believe that it's Black people who have to lead conversations around race or be the educators in the room, whereas Black and brown people are not oppressing themselves, right? Let's be honest. Structural racism is not set up to benefit them. It has been set up by white people, and it benefits white people. And so, one of the main takeaways for me personally, as a white female, is how my work in this field really has to be about speaking with and to other white people, because presumably they will feel safer with me to explore certain vulnerabilities because of a presumed shared identification that we have. And it's even with this session, I wondered if it was appropriate for me to be having the session with you, because it's yet another white person being given a platform on issues pertaining to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And, is that appropriate? Is that important? And for me, the fact that this is happening at our business school, which is, it's very multicultural. There's a bunch of nationalities that we work with, that we serve, from MBA students to our clients. But let's be honest, business in this world is largely a white world. And so I think that the specificity of this environment makes, this was my own thought process, right? In working through whether or not it was even appropriate to kind of helm a conversation like this with you. But there's
for just sharing and kind of my kind of background, and I guess some of the things that inform my interest in this area, throughout my life, are that I'm Anglo-Asian. My name Jim Carrick Birtwell belies that, but my dad came to Britain in the mid-60s from Nairobi in Kenya. I was brought up as a sort of nominal Muslim, and my name, it's strange, I have this schizophrenic sense, is and was Jamil Saeed. And I changed my name when I was 18 years old. My parents separated. They ended up getting back together later in life, but that's another story. But it was around a really clear sense in my life of growing up in Manchester, that I didn't really have the social capital to understand that identity. I didn't speak Urdu. We didn't really have relatives or friends or family that could identify with that name. So it was very other, and I couldn't represent it. And I was on the receiving end of either explicit kind of racism, and certainly I know my dad and my brothers who were darker skinned than I had experienced that. But as I went into my teens and I was thinking about, okay, what happens next in terms of further education and university, and then beyond that in the world of work, I knew that would be a potent tool for discrimination against me, and I didn't have the kind of the privilege, the social capital, or the confidence to want to do that. So swerved it and changed my name and adopted my mother's maiden name. Carrick Birtwell came across because my wife was a Carrick, and we were both into equality, so we fused those two together. But I think the important thing is that to me has given me a very, very clear sense throughout my life of what it feels like to be judged in a reasonably invisible way. And I, if you like, now feel that I'm in a position of relative privilege, relative status and power, with access to a kind of global community of business leaders, and a platform and tools, events and content to communicate and reach those people. And I think some of the events in recent times have also provoked me out of a certain kind of complacency for, okay, well, I'm doing certain things, but I've not had to share that backstory necessarily. I've not had to put myself out there to say, it's not just good enough to be doing the right thing. I'm motivated to be involved in significant structural change. And I think the energy that's required from that, I think, comes from an acknowledgement that it requires courage. And it requires a certain, and courage is all about the potential loss of something, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you've got no risk of losing anything, there's no courage required.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, as a pseudo white ally of Black people, I understand what it's, or can imagine, if you like. It's not my lived experience, but I can understand what it's like to feel a sense of discrimination at every turn in your life.
Jim, this is an incredible thing to share. Thank you. It's very, I mean, it's yeah. Sorry, you were saying.
No, I think it's part of, I'm very kind of motivated by other people being courageous, other people, wanting to know why are you doing this? I think that goes back to the earlier questions of being honest, not having all the answers, but wanting to approach things and put yourself out there. I mean, the level of courage, I think, comes from, for example, I'm inspired by, I've referenced him twice in this conversation already, Kwame, who, he changed his name from an English name to an African name, at about the same age in our lives. Now, I haven't had that conversation directly with him. I've only relatively recently got to know him. I would have that conversation gingerly with him, and with a huge amount of humility, because he's gone in reverse. He had that will, confidence to be a social activist, to be a change agent through changing his name.
Yeah.
Exactly the time I reversed into a position of safety. But that gives us a shared experience. We've been on different journeys, but he describes me as a white ally now, and actually, the movement that he's looking needs white allies, but I think fundamentally needs that level of honesty as well.
Can I ask, do you miss Jamil Said? Do you speak to him? Is he a kind of adjacent self, or is he your youth?
No, he's an adjacent self. So my family call me Jamil. Friends who've known me, all my life, and I'm very fortunate. I've got friendships in my life from very early in my life. I'm Jamil. I'm very happy with that sort of dual identity. I find it very enriching. But I also, I guess I'm telling that story because I feel in a relative position of privilege now. And I think there's a responsibility to be able to have that level of honesty about what your engagement with this is. You don't need to have a backstory like that, obviously, to care and be entirely committed to change and social justice. But I think if you have, it makes you more approachable. And I think if you recognize the vulnerability and the hurt and the pain and the exhaustion that other people have felt throughout their lives, whereas me with a change of name deed significantly dodged a lot of that, then it allows you to draw alongside other people. And I think
Mhm.
power in that.
What's really incredible about your story to me is that if we're thinking about what intersectionality can mean, what the future potential is there, it's quite radical to think about holding space for us to recognize that we do not know what others have been through, because you have experienced racism, you were otherized, you then sort of were able to leave that behind, experience, I mean, you present as white, you pass as white, you have been able to experience what it means to grow up in your career as a white man, the apogee of privilege.
Mm.
um, and now you're secure enough to somehow understand the fullness of your experience and reflect on a career that, even as you had your own kind of complicated sort of relationship to racism, structural inequity, a certain kind of security allows you to share this story, reflect on what it means, think about your work. You have a sort of, if we're talking about lived experience, you have a lived experience from across the spectrum,
Mm.
right? And people wouldn't necessarily know that about you if they were to just meet you or learn what it is you do for a living.
No, they wouldn't. And I think, but again, I think the humility that comes with confidence and comes with security is powerful.
Hmm.
And allowing, to share that, I think it allows, again, I keep saying this, it makes you relatable.
Mm-hmm.
I think those stories, if we allow one another to tell our stories,
Mm.
I think going back to where we started this conversation, intersectionality becomes
Mm-hmm.
richness,
Mm-hmm.
because it becomes everything that we hope for. We know that the research says that all forms of diversity create productivity. But,
Sure.
but I think the time for I was listening to one of your other conversations that you've done recently with some MBA students. The time for the business case behind diversity and inclusion is gone. That's everybody gets that. And the people
Mm-hmm.
that don't get that don't want to know.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, how do we move beyond that? If we know this is self-evidently true and self-evidently sensible, why is it not happening? And I think that we're at a really interesting point. So there are no givens with what
Mm.
happened. 68 million people in the recent US election, voted for Trump.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and everything that goes with that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we can't take things for granted in this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, maybe it's both because we just studied literature and have an interest and appreciation for theater, but in terms of being able to understand other people's stories and maybe truly even inhabit them for a period of time, it strikes me that for a world obsessed with the hot take, the tweet, the kind of short form YouTube clip, that there aren't necessarily shortcuts here, that reading a novel by a Black British author uh, or a Black American author might be an infinitely more productive thing to do than reading a 2-minute piece on Medium, right? That somehow art or literature or the ability to actually step into another's frame of view and see the world through them and see where they want to take you is a really understudied and underappreciated way of how change might happen. How do you square, from your point of view, something like the immersion that a novel or a play or another kind of artistic experience to create empathy and create exposure to another worldview? How do you square that against what corporations come to you with, which is, we need a training, we need best practices, we need learning, we do need to tick a box? this is, I think I'm just keeping an eye on the time. Let's have this be our last sort of topic. But, is there a happy medium between a corporation that wants efficiency and a quick win versus the long, deliberative, no shortcut process toward genuine change?
Hmm. Well, I'd love to hear your answer on that as well. So I'll try and be brief. I think so. Two versions of it. I think in terms of what's the role that kind of art and literature play, and maybe how does that link with how corporates teach their people. I think people are able to concentrate on issues more in a more concentrated way if you hold up the mirror of art to them. I think that's what plays are all about, for example, or literature is all about. You recognize in the other characters situations, people, either elements in your own life or in lives going on around you. And it allows you to reflect on a different scenario than you would necessarily have thought of in your own lived experience.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's very powerful at that level. I think what organizations are doing now is recognizing that the scale of change that's now required, and also the fact that millennials and Gen Z have absolutely climbed on board with the issues arising out of Black Lives Matter and saying, we want action and we want it now.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not part of the change and the solutions and you're demonstrating that, and we don't mean PR tricks, we mean real, authentic action to change, you're part of the problem. And that becomes an existential threat because of the scale of it and because of how mobilized that generation are on social media.
Mm-hmm.
They command an enormous amount of power as consumers, but also as the workforce of the future, right? In terms of
Mm-hmm.
where they will opt to go. And so the war for talent's tied up in this as well. And so businesses are having to move. And it goes back to what I was saying about leaders are recognizing it's not just about carrying on with the P&L the way it was. We've got to understand inclusion. We can't be complacent about that. And they often need help from third parties, and they need their own their safe places for that conversation. But everybody else in the business kind of recognizes we have to change. That feels to me what's going on. I'm not sure if that answered your question at all, but I'd be interested in your take on this. I mean, what do you feel is going on in terms of the actions in the world, and are people mobilized significantly to move forwards, or are they caught in paralysis with reflection or not knowing?
So again, this is coming from my subject position as a white woman, which has a lot of baggage, historical and present day, for a variety of reasons. But for me, there's two main fronts that count for me personally, and as I kind of look at my fellow white people. One is there just has to be certain knowledge that exists. And this is where I see companies like you coming in. What terms are no longer used because they're racist? What terms do people now have to use, right? Like there are just certain facts that people have to be responsible for that show respect toward the diverse workplaces that they work in and toward a diverse world that is so there's that kind of fact level of just knowledge. And I really don't think there's a lot of compromise there, because this is about basic, lawful regulations around respecting everyone's dignity and right to live free from persecution and abuse. And there is a lot of persecution and abuse happening. It's not hyperbole to say that has to be protected against urgently. And then the other thing is a more diffuse front that I think evades these kinds of learnings and seminars and teachings. And this is really cultural. So there's a Black performance artist from the US, Ziwe Fumudo, who has this amazing web series on racism where she basically puts white people and comedians often in the hot seat and asks them incredible questions about race. And you watch people squirm, you watch them blush. And it's, the questions she'll ask them are, name 5 Black authors. Name 5 Black people. And often people can't do it. And so I'm watching this laughing uncomfortably because it's a laugh of recognition, it's a laugh of fear, it's a laugh of, oh my goodness, am I one of those white people, right? There's a lot of fear around being a good white person or a bad white person. And, the main thing that her series made me do was a real kind of cultural audit of the culture that I consume.
Yeah.
What books am I reading? What music am I listening to? Who do I follow on Instagram? And I realized it was simply too white.
Yeah.
And this is pernicious. It's insidious. It happens so slowly, right? But it happens in feedback loops. And, so the first thing I did when I had this realization wasn't buying a book about how to be an anti-racist. It was, I bought Bernadine Evaristo's book, Girl, Woman, Other, because I need more Black female authors in my life.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of work combined with baseline important facts, best practices that together I think can help to create a more durable mindset shift. But it does require some intentionality.
Yeah.
And my life is richer for following BET, Black Entertainment Television, on Instagram,
Yeah.
right? I'm getting exposed to new artists. I've learned about some new TV shows. Like it's right. It's additive. This is the thing that I wish I could share with white people who feel attacked by these narratives or feel that something is being taken from them when we talk about empowering other people, is that this isn't a zero-sum game. This is everyone benefits when we have dignity and humanity afforded to all, and everyone is given the possibility to flourish, right, and to not be boxed in. So
well, I applaud that. I think we're out of time, but I think that's what's, as my final comment would be, I think that's what's so exciting about the program of events that you're curating and putting together. I know they've started, and hopefully they'll go on and on and on, because I think pulling together different perspectives from voices and angles that people otherwise wouldn't come across, it opens that door. And I think, there's a lot about this subject, which, as I said at the start, is gnarly, is challenging, is difficult. But I think my abiding feeling is that there is a huge opportunity here. This is, we want to be on the right side of history. And I hope we look back on this period in our lives as a moment in history where things changed. And the same amount of energy goes into creating that change and being aware of, nuances of behavior and the way we speak that we've already covered in other aspects, whether it's to do with gender, whether it's to do with LGBTQ. There is a kind of now a grammar, a syntax, a way of conducting ourselves, which is completely different to the way it was even 10 years ago.
It's so true. It's so true.
And I think if we can capture that in areas that haven't yet made that move, but with the same level of energy and focus and dedication, then I am enormously optimistic about the kind of the richness and the opportunity for that, truly kind of diverse, inclusive, set of environments, societies, workplaces that we can create.
Well, on that, I couldn't have ended on a better note. Jim, we invite everyone watching to tune into session 2 of this intersectionality and inclusion series, which is on women entrepreneurs, building inclusivity and tackling world scale challenges. Just as you said, on Thursday, so tomorrow, December 3rd at 1900 GMT. You can register on the events page of the Oxford Said website. And Jim, I can't thank you enough for being game enough to participate in this chat. I really enjoyed it, and I was absolutely delighted at your kind of candidness and willing to go there, really.
Well, no, thank you. I really enjoyed chatting to you likewise, and really enjoyed this conversation, and hope it builds and builds.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you to everyone listening.